All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to STL History Live. My name is Aaron Pelker, and I'm a Community Engagement Coordinator at the Missouri History Museum, and I want to thank you for spending part of your Friday afternoon with us. Before we get to today's presentation on the 1904 World's Fair, looking back at opening day, I'd like to make a couple of brief remarks. The first is to thank two key contributors that help make programs like this possible: city and county residents and their contributions through the Zoo Museum Tax District, and of course, our museum members. If you're already a member, thank you for your generosity. If you're not but would like to learn more about the membership process, please check the chat feature on Zoom for a URL link to our membership page on our website. Next, I want to take a moment to explain some of the features on Zoom. If you look at your toolbar on the Zoom app at the bottom, you'll see two features I'd like to highlight: closed captioning and the Q&A feature. You can enable closed captioning by clicking on the CC box on your toolbar. After our presentation, which will last for about 30 minutes, there will be about 10 minutes for Q&A. You can use the Q&A dialog box on the Zoom app toolbar to submit those questions, but we do ask that you wait until the end of the lecture to submit those questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Also, if you must leave the presentation early, we are recording today's lecture, and it will eventually be made available on the Missouri History Museum's YouTube channel. So with that, I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker, Sharon Smith, Curator for Civic and Personal Identity. And thank you for finding yourself here. Enjoy, and take it away, Sharon.
Okay, now I need to figure out how I get my screen. I'm always just a little bit confused here. Do I touch the share screen? And there we are. Okay. All right. So thank you, Aaron, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to give a special welcome to anyone joining us from the 1904 World's Fair Society. You truly are the experts on all things 1904 World's Fair, so please bear with me. This is not a detail of the World's Fair that I have been able to research in depth, except for this presentation. I've been able to dig very deep into the published World's Fair bulletins. They are mostly monthly publications that started in 1899. They chronicle all the activities of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company in great detail, often providing photos as well. It was to these monthly documents that I could turn in this time of quarantine. The Missouri Historical Society owns a complete run of them, and when we are eventually open, you too can come and explore them in person, as well as peruse the many photographs and archives of the World's Fair Company. In the meantime, you can find the bulletins digitally at the MU Digital Library provided by the University of Missouri. So let's get started. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition was proposed to commemorate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. 100 years later would be 1903, yet we all know the St. Louis World's Fair was held in 1904. Why the discrepancy in years, you might ask? In my many World's Fair presentations, this discrepancy is but a mere mention because I mostly focus on the 1904 World's Fair. But how did it all play out? Why that postponement? Let's go back to the beginning of the story of how St. Louis got her World's Fair and why it took longer than expected. Not many cities can boast of hosting a World's Fair. Those cities that did from the late 1880s or 1800s through the turn of the century only numbered 7, some of them even hosting more than once. St. Louis, the 4th largest city at the turn of the 20th century, had high hopes of being one of those World's Fair cities. She bid on the World's Columbian Exposition to be held in 1892, which was ultimately postponed to 1893, which commemorated Columbus's voyage of 1492. Now, St. Louis lost that bid to Chicago. That, however, turned out to be a blessing when St. Louis and Pierre Chouteau, a member of the Missouri Historical Society, thought a better celebration for St. Louis would be the centennial of the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. St. Louis would be the perfect host city for such a historic commemoration. Plans began as early as 1899. Many committees formed and meetings were held to plan this great event. The planners determined that $15 million would be needed to host such an event. Incidentally, this is the same amount of money paid for the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. They would ask for a $5 million loan from the federal government, $5 million from the state of Missouri and city of St. Louis combined, and another $5 million from subscriptions sold. A committee of 200 formed, and you can see all the committees, well, you can't read them, but on that document there's a number of committees that took place over the course of the years to plan this. But a committee of 200 formed and went through the city selling the subscriptions for $10. Within a few months, they had raised that first $5 million. They received word that the federal government on March 3rd, 1901, passed the Sundry Civil Bill that would grant the city the third $5 million. The bill stipulated in Section 8 the following, quote, "An act to provide for celebrating the 100th anniversary of the purchase of the Louisiana Territory by the United States by holding an international exhibition in the city of St. Louis shall be opened to visitors not later than the first day of May 1903 and shall be closed no later than the first day of December thereafter." End quote. So the city fathers had secured the needed funds and they turned to the question of where to hold the fair. As early as September 1899, the Bulletin wrote, "Speculation as to the site of the fair continues to be very general." Now, that seems very likely that early on, and yet it seemed like maybe they took a lot longer than they could have to find the proposed site. Let's look at some of the World's Fair designs that came along. December 1900 in the Bulletin is the headline, "World's Fair Design, Plans for a Grand City and Suggestion for a Site" by Edward W. Furl, mechanical engineer and patent attorney. So here's some of Mr. Furl's remarks as detailed in that bulletin. "The accompanying drawing is a design for the World's Fair containing 970 acres, a circular lake embracing 235 acres of water, an interior plateau being reserved for state and official buildings, being 7/8 of a mile in diameter and containing 365 acres, the central pavilion to consist of an immense dome, and an observatory to be built over the dome from which the entire grounds and buildings could be seen. The best location for the aforesaid plan and arrangement would be that portion of Forest Park lying west of Union Avenue and east of the Skinker Road." Well, let's tuck that away. Next, March 1901, Mr. Alexander H. Smith, chairman of the Carondelet Businessmen's Association, proposed a site in Carondelet, beginning on the Mississippi River on the north side of Bates Street, then west to the Morgan Ford Road, a distance of 10,000 feet, then south to the south side of Loughborough, a distance of 4,500 feet, thence east to the eastern border of Carondelet Park, a distance of 6,100 feet, thence north to Bates Street at the place of beginning, a distance of 1,400 feet, the whole covering an area of 760 acres. Some of the advantages: the riverfront will not only add to the picturesque features of the fair, but will more than double the transportation facilities through the use of excursion boats from and to the city. So again, they're concerned about the water notion here because Chicago used the lakefront. So St. Louis, wanting to be better and certainly not missing out on any of the characteristics of Chicago, wondered how they could incorporate the Mississippi River. This would have been one of them. So there's the site of the Carondelet Park and a Google map that shows us sort of where that might have been. Another proposed site was near the waterworks. The bulletin didn't really go into much detail on this one, so I just show you the photo of it. Again, there's some water. Of course, the waterworks would have been close to the river. And then here we have A.M. Beinke's proposal. He was an architect, and his quote is, "Beginning at the river from riverfront, about 6 blocks north of Grand, to the south side of O'Fallon Park, taking in the park and 66 acres south of the park, thence further south to Natural Bridge." So you get another Google map here with a line drawing of the proposed area. And if we go here, we see a bird's eye view of that plan, and you see the river in the distance there in the background. And here's an image possibly of that same spot in O'Fallon Park. This again was not clear in the bulletin. There might have been several suggestions of O'Fallon Park. They were looking at a lot of the different parks in the city as possible sites. Here's another one, an electrician and inventor, John Anderson, and his idea, he's a little boastful. He says, "My plan is the result of much careful study of the subject on my part. I have attended many of the great expositions, and I am enthusiastic enough to hope that the St. Louis World's Fair will eclipse any previous affair of its kind. How to describe my plan, he says. It provides for large square grounds. And he focuses a lot then on this notion of triangles. He has a triangular tower that he says might be, 1,000 feet high. Well, this is important because, again, the fairs were always wanting to outdo themselves. And so, you know, if you got Paris, you had the Eiffel Tower. If you had Chicago, you had the Ferris wheel, which surpassed the Eiffel Tower. And so now St. Louis is trying to get past the Ferris wheel. And so this was Mr. Anderson's idea, was that this tower might be 1,000 feet high, the Eiffel Tower being only 985 feet. And he also thought that there would be options for ways that people could be at the very top. There would be this pendulum that would possibly run the whole entire length of the fair. This would swing all through the time that the exposition was open, and there would be a triangular lake, very different from any other lake. And so he's really concerned about all of this. And he also then proposes that there would be an elevated railway from one end of the grounds to the other, going down one side and back the other, and passing through the most important buildings. And he says this: it would do away with the most disagreeable feature of visiting big expositions, the tiresome tramps from one part of the grounds to the other. And so he's concerned that people will be tired, but he's got the answer, which is this elevated railway. Now, this site from the Bulletin, June 1901, the passage of the ordinance to present the use of the parks of the city for sites for the World's Fair has put speculation almost entirely out of the field. A large body of land of nearly 1,000 acres is what they're sort of thinking they need, intact with no street laid out through the district, can be had in this city, but in two places. One of them is Forest Park. To those who have said much regarding the destruction of beautiful scenery and ancient trees, only this can be said, quote, inspect Forest Park by walking through it. Begin at the Forest Park Highlands. That's now, for those who aren't St. Louisans, south of I-64. Pass through it uphill and down Vale in a northwesterly line until you reach the Washington University grounds, or begin at the entrance of de Bolivar Avenue and walk southwest until you reach the Skinker Road. That would be about where the History Museum lies, and go towards Skinker. Evidence of neglect and decay is everywhere, they say. The comparison of this region with the more cultivated East End, which was the area that most people went to when they went to Forest Park before this will immediately become apparent. The soil is difficult and rough, the grass thin and full of weeds, decaying vegetation. What a boon this fair would be for Forest Park, end quote. So while there were all these proposals, Forest Park ultimately was selected, at least the western half of over 600 acres. More land would be added to make it over 1,200 acres, and that was more than enough to surpass any fair, including especially Chicago. So let's look at Forest Park for a minute. The Pretty Birch Drive is the picture's title here. I'm not sure whether this picture is part of the World's Fair Fairgrounds or just outside of it. It certainly would be more in the eastern section where that roadway is a little more finished. People could go out there on a Sunday drive and take in the pastoral settings of Forest Park. But whether or not it is, it certainly was a very wooded and very beautiful, dense, spacious place that was going to be considered as this World's Fair Fairgrounds. There are some other photos that were in the bulletin in August 1901. The one that I love is actually the biggest one right here. That's titled The Wilderness from Skinker Road. So when I go to work every day at the Library and Research Center, when I was, you know, this wilderness, some of it still exists up in the southwestern corner anyway. It's still somewhat wilderness. And so this might be an image that could still look very similar today. But some of these images of the wooded terrain and yet the very hilly terrain also is going to come into play. So when we get to the August 1901 bulletin, David R. Francis has some things to say about the advantages of Forest Park, and he says this: the plan of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition is that the present contour lines of the park shall be preserved. The St. Louis Exposition will not present one main picture, but a series of pictures, all of which shall be equally beautiful. The size of the St. Louis Fair, ranging over 1,000 acres, and the rolling character of its site would make the single picture plan adopted in, say, Buffalo, 1901, impractical. St. Louis's exposition will not be built on a plain. There will be grades and slopes and hills and valleys. All former expositions have been built on surfaces, showing slight, if any, variations in contour. Exposition visitors are tired of park grounds laid out with a sole eye to the symmetry. As to the number of buildings and features, we want to keep the plan of our exposition sufficiently elastic. That's interesting. So that we can at any time add a building or a feature without destroying the unity of the plan. We might also add in hindsight or change the date. I will say that David R. Francis was the president of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company, for those who might not know that. So now let's look at some of the comments that were appearing in the bulletins when the opening in 1903 is always mentioned as that being the opening. So here, now this bulletin cover is August 1901, but we're going to jump back even a little further than that. I just didn't want to include all the covers, but let's go back to February, March. The president of the Third National Bank of St. Louis, why he's asked, I'm not sure, but it's Charles Huttig, and he has this to say about the start of the fair. The idea of commemorating the acquisition of the territory known as the Louisiana Purchase by the holding of an international exposition or World's Fair during its centennial anniversary was first promulgated by the Missouri Historical Society in the year 1898. It is proposed to hold the fair in 1903, and nothing will be left undone to make it a greater success than any exposition held in this or any other country. The next month, March 1901, page 13, the headline says, "It's not so. The report from Chicago that the St. Louis World's Fair may be postponed until 1905. So now that headline comes from a telegram that was, the text was included in the bulletin, and here's the quoted text. "A movement has been started to secure the postponement of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition at St. Louis until 1905. The principal reason for delay is the desire of St. Louis to outdo the Chicago Exposition," and they get the date wrong, "of 1895. 1 year's postponement would bring it in the midst of a presidential campaign, so it is proposed to have the formal exercises in 1903, but hold the real show 2 years later." That's the end of the telegram. Now, the bulletin then includes interviews with various directors of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, including David R. Francis, who says, "There is no question of the ability and intention of St. Louis to get ready for the fair by 1903. If any postponement is decided upon, and mind you, I do not say it will be owing to the difficulty in getting the foreign exhibits ready. We are going ahead with the intention of holding the fair in 1903. End quote. Our Mr. Pierre Chateau that we saw earlier says, "I have heard nothing of the movement, and anyway, such a move would be folly." May 1901, in the bulletin, page 1, "All talk of postponing the fair to 1904 is unofficial. The leaders of the movement have neither considered the question nor admitted the necessity of doing so." And then in the bulletin that we see here, August 1901, page 1, "The Louisiana Purchase Exposition will be opened on April 30th, 1903, just 100 years after Napoleon signed the Louisiana Territory Treaty." So all's going along, 1903. Also in this bulletin that we see the cover here, there was an article about an order being placed for 500,000 labels because the first 300,000 were all used up. Now, that is what we're talking about here. So the labels were things that were sent out for various reasons, advertising the fair. And so you see World's Fair 1903, the one above is a button, commemorative button handed out at the Pan Am exposition earlier this year in 1901. And they were handed out to lots and lots of people with that date, 1903. The stamp in the middle there was a stamp that was going to be placed as a revenue stamp that would have been placed on bottles and patent medicines and so forth. So, World's Fair again, 1903. And the one on the right, that was an image that would be burned onto the packing crates and boxes that would come to the World's Fair site, or that would be sent out for other advertisement purposes. All of these saying 1903. In mass quantities, these things went out. So then we get to August 20th, 1901. President McKinley issued a proclamation to all the foreign nations to participate in the Louisiana Purchase Exposition to be held in St. Louis, Missouri, USA in 1903. St. Louis wanted more foreign participation than any other host city. And as noted in the September 1901 bulletin, in which a photo engraving of this proclamation was enclosed, the bulletin said, "The original document will be of great historic value someday." Well, that's true because it has the wrong date on it, but there you go. Now, Forest Park was already a well-established St. Louis landmark, officially open to the public since June 24th, 1876, especially that eastern part. It featured 19 miles of road, 20 miles of walking paths, and 8 bridges over the River de Pere. Scattered lakes added to the park's pastoral setting. So now, as mentioned before, it was just the western section of that park was not going to be nearly enough. So the planners went to the Washington University, was just getting ready to build a new campus just west of the city, just along this, this area of Forest Park. And they leased all of that campus for $750,000. And they still needed more land, so they leased all of the land south of the campus along Skinker between Forsyth and Clayton. Those are today's roads, Forsyth and Clayton. They also leased the land along Lindell Avenue from Washington University to Union. Now, with 1,240 acres, the planners believed they had enough to host what they planned to be the largest World's Fair ever, and certainly would have beaten Chicago by about double their landmass. The first formal activity of the exposition company was to take control of the western half of the park. They did that noon, September 3rd, 1901, when Treasurer William H. Thompson, in mid-80-degree temperature, drove a stake into the approximate middle of the soon-to-be World's Fair grounds. The 2,000 spectators heard the following. David R. Francis said, "We have met here this morning in an informal manner and without notice to take the first step in the physical work of the great undertaking which was inaugurated in this city 3 years ago. Mr. Thompson, you will drive the stake." And then Isaac Taylor, director of works, said, "Gentlemen, the stake has been driven. It represents the architectural center of the entire grounds. I can say that on the 30th day of April, 1903, if the Lord gives me the present health that I have, I will turn over to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company the grandest, most magnificent exposition the world has ever seen. The World's Fair will be completed on time." Here we have a couple more views from the bulletin, looking in various parts of the fairgrounds, the would-be fairgrounds from Stake 10. I'm not sure where that is. It did not tell me, but those were some views of that, again, wilderness part of the fairgrounds. And then we have 3 months later, the official groundbreaking ceremony takes place. The grand ceremony was altered due to the 10-degree weather and 5 inches of snow on the frozen ground. Some 300 daring souls braved the weather to attend the groundbreaking. At 1:00 p.m., David R. Francis and others used several selected shovels for the occasion. You see there, 2 of which are in the collections of the Missouri Historical Society. The spot chosen was the future site of the Education Building. David R. Francis addressed the crowd with a few remarks. Within 16 months of this day, still April 1903, the now bleak and barren scene that stretches before us will have been transformed into a picture of surpassing loveliness, inspiring, uplifting, and impressive, end quote. There was an invocation, and then each director turned a shovel full of dirt, placed it in the waiting horse-drawn wagon, and then the celebration retreated to the Coliseum. Now, this almost haunting image was taken just a month or so later in early 1902, and it shows how much of a forest the northwestern portion of Forest Park was. The image is looking west with Washington University's administration building there in the distance. This is one of the last images of Forest Park with this portion of the River de Pere above ground. All of that would be buried as part of the transformation of the park. Here we are again in that same time period, the time of the groundbreaking, and we have no postponement in the bulletin there. You see that heading. You have this picture here of this little piece that you could cut out of the bulletin, and it says you could put it in your hat, which is just weird. Paste it in your hat. I don't know what that means. But anyway, according to Mark Bennett, in his reminiscence of the World's Fair, he recounted that by April 1902, with 1 year to go before the 1903 opening, 7 palaces, including the Washington University group, were, quote, nearly completed and some ready for occupancy. That sounds promising until one realizes that there were numerous buildings that had not even been started yet, and many foreign nations not yet committed. Also in January 1902, this World's Fair edition map is shown in the bulletin, and it was distributed free as part of the Brown Shoe Company advertisement. You can see the salesman there and the various buildings of Brown Shoe. And yet again, there's the 1903 date right there plastered across the middle. This went out to a lot of people. This is January of 02. February of 02, oh, let's stay here for a second, sorry. February of 1902, the headline says, "St. Louis will be ready." David R. Francis, however, went to Washington, D.C. to consult with the Secretary of State because he was concerned that not enough foreign nations were actually committing to coming to St. Louis. And so now the government, the federal government, is a bit concerned as well. And, you know, always when you commit to a plan like this, you want to make sure it's the biggest and best. You know, Chicago thought that too, and then we can build on Chicago and we can become the biggest and best, and the federal government certainly doesn't want to fail. So there was this conversation among the various governors of the Louisiana Purchase states, with some comments from several of them, including this one from the governor of Nebraska, who said a postponement of 1 year would dampen the ardor, destroy interest and activity, require the work of enthusing and enlisting interest and activity to be done all over again. The governor of Missouri says, it is the universal desire to hold the exposition in 1903. If, however, as suggested by some of the directors, it is impossible to get ready for it by that time, then it seems it should be postponed until 1905. I think he must have talked to that Chicago telegram writer, because he says it would be impractical to have a successful exposition during a presidential year. It is full time, though, that this question was definitely settled. So the governor of Missouri is like, let's get this resolved. Well, it gets resolved. So here's our two bulletin covers. And what we have is by, throughout the next couple months, there were monthly updates that said there would be no postponement until May of 1902, when Congress amended their sundry civil bill to read as follows. And it says this. Section 8, that said commission shall provide for the dedication of the buildings of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition in said city of St. Louis, not later than the 30th day of April, 1903, with appropriate ceremonies, and thereafter said exposition shall be open to visitors not later than the first day of May, 1904, and shall be closed not later than the first day of December thereafter. So it was once the federal government was made aware of the fact that the foreign nations hadn't all committed in a timely manner, and there was some concern that this could not then be the promised amazing fair that it was destined to be. There was an easy amendment to that sundry civil bill, and so that's what we have. And we go then to April 30th, 1903. With that simple amending of the bill, St. Louis would wait another year and would host the 1904 World's Fair, still to be known as the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. Their original opening date of April 30th would now be dedication day, an opportunity to show off the grounds and the progress to date. So there's a picture of the bulletin of that particular the dedication volume, and it's very pretty, and there's lots of information, lots of photos, including a couple of these kinds of photos that are actually in our collection as well. So you've got parades and you've got activities going on. You can see that the one on the right, there's a scaffolding around what would become the Louisiana Purchase Monument, a centerpiece for the fairgrounds. And of course, people are milling about what we know of as Brookings Hall, but is the administration building there, part of Washington University campus. With weather only a bit of a factor, cold and cloudy with a hint of rain, the opening day of the dedication event was witnessed by hundreds of thousands, and the 3-day event consisted of parades, speeches, music, and fireworks. Now, as the year rolled on, St. Louisans looked forward to the next celebration, the opening day of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition, known as the St. Louis 1904 World's Fair. 10 days before opening day, there was a 12-hour snowstorm, but opening day, April 30th, 1904, was spring-like, with a crowd of over 187,000 people, larger than Chicago, and that's always important. A short prayer began the ceremonies, and then David R. Francis spoke the words, "Open ye gates, swing wide ye portals." 2 hours of speeches, and the fair officially opened when Francis touched the telegraph key, sending a signal to the White House, and President Theodore Roosevelt touched a golden telegraph key, signaling back to Francis to open the fair. With that signal, the fair began with flags unfurling and fountains flowing. Sousa's band played, and a 500-voice choir sang Hymn of the West, the official fair song. The bulletin of May 1904 said this. I think this is a fitting way to end. Quote, from April 30 to December 1st, 1904, St. Louis will be the best place in the world for a vacation. The worst thing about it will be the reluctance of the visitor to leave at the end of a week or a month, or even 2 months. For varied attractiveness and inexhaustible stores of interest, the world has never had a chance to see anything comparable to the Louisiana Purchase Exposition and may never see its likes again. To each visitor, every day at the exposition will be a day of inspiring discoveries and delightful surprises, arousing in him a more comprehensive interest in the activities of life and a stronger relish of existence. So that's how we get from 1903 to 1904. I hope that you've enjoyed that. I will see if we can figure out where the questions are. I did something wrong. Let me get that slide back up. There we are. And do we have any questions? Do you think that the desire to steal the 1904 Olympics helped make it easier to postpone to 1904? You know, it certainly didn't hurt. I think that once it was clear that everything, you know, for those who might not be as familiar with all that was going on, Chicago was supposed to have those 1904 Olympics. St. Louis having the fair in 2003, that made some sense that those two cities could have differing opportunities to host a particular event. But once St. Louis moved it to 1904, I think then the scramble was, well, if we're going to do one thing, why not make sure that we have it all? And I think there was always this desire, what we're going to do with the physical culture part of the World's Fair, and getting the Olympics certainly made that happen. You know, I'm not quite sure when it was actually decided. I know the date, I know this answer to the next question, which was when was it decided to hold the Olympics, but I can't tell you right off the top of my head. I think it's going to be somewhere right around the time that they make this change to move to 1904. They then look to the city of Chicago, and they consult the International Olympic Committee, and very quickly are able to make that arrangement to have everything happen in St. Louis. It would end up being a bust, really, in the sense that after that, the Olympic committees never allowed, you know, both things to happen simultaneously in the same place, because people couldn't, you know, they had enough to do with like visiting the fair. How can you also spend time at the Olympics? And so it really became hard to balance all of that. Maybe today, when we're a little more savvy about how we can get around, but you know, it was hard in 1904. The next question is, when will the Missouri Historical Society have a major exhibition again on the 1904 World's Fair? That's a good question, and that's coming. So we, as part of our 2020s plan for redoing all of our major core gallery exhibits, the World's Fair will be one of those. With this particular moment in time, I hesitate to give you the date. The plans were about 2022, 23. I think it's 23 is when it got moved to. So stay tuned, but I think it's going to be somewhere in 23, and the works are already being started. We're already starting those plans for that new look of the World's Fair exhibit. We're very excited about that. What do you think was the most impressive thing on exhibit about the World's Fair? The organ. Yeah, I think some of the things that, I can't imagine. First of all, Mike, I can't really, it's hard to pinpoint one thing, right? And when I look at the fair, just the immensity of the space, and I drive through Forest Park, and I've looked at those photographs so many times, I can't picture it there. I just can't picture it there. I can't picture the festival hall on Art Hill that totally blocked the art museum, because that seems like an imposing building in and of itself. And to think that there was a building more imposing in front of it makes it very difficult for me to think of like one thing. But that festival hall organ of, you know, thousands and thousands of pipes had to have been pretty impressive. The floral clock that sat over off across from Skinker, across the road from Skinker there, had to be really amazing. So a lot of things, and I think that could be a whole talk, right, in and of itself. Let's see, what research archives did you use to research this part of St. Louis history? Yeah, so again, it was really just the Missouri, or it was the World's Fair Bulletins, and that's what they're called. You can Google that, and that MU Digital Library will come up, or Google MU Digital Library. For now, that's the way you would have to do it. You could also, when we open our library and research center, you can actually come back and look at them. We have them all in hard, like in real print, and they're a monthly publication, and you can read there. I read through all the way up to the time when I stopped looking, because we realized when they had actually changed the date to 1904. They're amazing, and so that's where you could find them currently. And once we're back open, come and visit the library. Was the Missouri building supposed to be permanent, or was it temporary? That's a good question. I think there was some conversation. Again, there's so many of these aspects that you could dig into in much more detail, or the World's Fair Society knows these questions or these answers. But there was some conversation in the early readings of those bulletins that it might have been a permanent structure, and that the Missouri Historical Society might actually have taken that space once the fair was over. It would have made perfect sense. And the Missouri Historical Society was located downtown and looking to expand as well. So that would have been a good place for the Missouri Historical Society to come and take over on that fairground space. Unfortunately, with the building burning, it had burnt too far to actually be recovered. Let's see, the Missouri handout says the Missouri building was temporary. So yeah, it could be, I don't know. But I also see in those early bulletins that I think there was some talk about that. Let's see. The World's Fair Society was working on plans to recreate the floral clock. Is there any interest still in doing that? I know that partly has to do with, and they could answer that question. You can visit their website and ask that question of the president, who's Mike Truax. I think that part of that has to do with what they can do in the park, and Forest Park Forever, and the plans that have already been made for the beautification of the park. Although it would be a really cool thing to see this huge floral clock actually running. We have the Floral Clock Works on loan to us from the World's Fair Society that sit in that World's Fair space currently. Let's see. So there's a question about somebody whose grandfather was 12 and his family was in the business of road grading. They worked on the World's Fair construction. Do you have records that may list construction companies? Yes, I think in the archives we have all of the business papers of the Louisiana Purchase Exposition Company. So again, those are housed in our archives at the Library and Research Center, and sometimes you can find those fairly easily. Sometimes it's a needle in a haystack, but there are lots of opportunities to go through and look at the bids that were put through the company when they were building the fair. So that would be a conversation to have once you could come back into the library and check with the archivist. A comment back from the World's Fair Society was that there was no place that could be found to safely build the floral clock restoration. So that's the answer, is that, I think they looked, and I think it would have been a really cool thing. But when the park is used as heavily as it is now, if they were trying to go back to the World's Fair, that would have been, or back to the World's Fair site in Forest Park, that would have been hard with as much space is taken up now with all of the other things that are in the park. So I don't see any other questions at this point. Are there any more? Do we have time for any more? So the axle question comes up. That's a tempting one. I would say, there were lots of rumors, and there's this whole urban myth about where the axle to the Ferris wheel is. So we did get the Ferris wheel that became the tallest thing, which wasn't any taller than the one in Chicago because it was the same one. And what happened to it afterward? And there were lots of myths surrounding the fact that maybe it got buried somewhere in Forest Park or just outside of the park on the other parts of the fairgrounds. There is more indication with the World's Fair Society that says that maybe that there were clear indications that it was actually carted away and taken back to Chicago, to the Chicago Wrecking Company, which is the company that actually took the fair apart. destroyed it after the end of the fair, and that it was then melted down for scrap metal later. That's the sad story. I really like the one where it's buried in Forest Park, but the World's Fair Society people have done a lot of work on that, so we'll go with that one. So, any others?
If that's it, I do want to thank Sharon again and thank all of you for attending today's STL History Live. And of course, again, thanks Sharon for that fascinating look at the opening day of the 1904 World's Fair. Your feedback is always important to us, so we would really appreciate it if you could take our short survey. A Kobo Toolbox survey should have opened in one of your browser tabs, so please keep an eye out for that when we end the session. I do want to thank you again, and please remember that you can find the full schedule of STL History Live on the Missouri Historical Society's website, mohistory.org, and our Facebook page. But please join us next time on Tuesday, May 5th at 11 a.m. for our next lecture titled Get Your Hamilton Fix. So thanks again and enjoy your weekend.